Sometimes I wonder, Sam, if it wouldn't be just as well to stay in the positive domain all the time. And I know that you are no longer on Twitter, for example, and so that's obviously one of the places where you've detached yourself from the proliferation of, you might say, unnecessary and polarizing conflict. But you just did indicate that you feel either a moral obligation or an intellectual pull towards keeping abreast of the domain of life that constitutes more problems. And so why do you think that balance is necessary? Why don't you forego that entirely and stay within the domain of the positive? I mean, you seem to have concluded that balancing them is actually better for you in some sense, or maybe better in general. So why did you conclude that?
Yeah, well, it's a question I continue to ask myself because, you only have one life, or, I would say you only have one life you can be sure of. And so why not live it in the happiest manner possible? But I do find that there are certain moments. First of all, my interests are wider than can be encompassed just by things like meditation and narrowly focusing on questions about how to live the most meaningful possible life. Right? It's not all just about maximizing mental pleasure or even one's ethical wisdom moment to moment. They're just things that interest me that I want to talk about that really don't belong over at Waking Up, but they do belong on my podcast. So talking about physics, say, right? That's just interesting, and I like to do that. So there's that. As you say, I deleted my Twitter account, which is an important part of the answer to your first question of just what has gotten better for me in the last 12 months. That was, I really am embarrassed to say what a life hack that turned out to be, to get off Twitter. We can talk about why I did if you want, but the net result has been almost unambiguously positive. I mean, there's a slight sense, certainly when the things in the news are really heating up, that I could be missing something, or I'm not party to the conversation that's happening at that kind of interval, where people are responding to things every 30 seconds. But the truth is, I don't have to be, because what I have found is that when you don't have an opportunity to just blurt out your instantaneous response to something that's happening in the news or something you saw in your timeline, and you have to let your response to it cure over the course of days, in my case, because I have to decide, okay, is this important enough for me to actually talk about it on my podcast? And I might not be, podcasting again for another 3 days or even a week. And so many things don't survive that test. They just 98% of things just fall by the wayside, because the truth is, you didn't have to broadcast your opinion about that thing that happened on that campus, by that indiscretion committed by that stupid blue-haired person. Right. So it's just like you didn't have to weigh in, and you didn't have to reap all of the attendant poison of having weighed in, and you didn't have to worry about whether you should respond to that poison and those misunderstandings generated there. And I noticed in retrospect that, and I dimly knew this when I was on Twitter, but I didn't fully appreciate it until I was off, that it was no exaggeration to say that basically every bad thing in my life, apart from the sickness of the people close to me, was a result of something I had done on Twitter, right? Or something that I had seen on Twitter.
I can relate to that
I felt I needed to respond to. So it was just this kind of hallucination machine that I had invited into the center of my life, and getting rid of it really modified my sense of not just what I have to do on a day-to-day basis and what I should do, but just of my own existence, right? Like, there was something about my digital existence that was claiming too much real estate in my conception of myself as a person, right? And
you might have put your finger on it, at least to some degree, there with something like your observation about whether or not you're willing to put time into it. I've had many discussions with my family about Twitter in particular, and I would tend to agree with you that much of the negativity that I do run into in my life is a consequence of Twitter. And so now I use Twitter to stay abreast of the sorts of things that you describe that you might be able to get access to on Twitter as well, current events. And there is that temptation to respond immediately. But you intimated that maybe a good rule of thumb is something like, if you're not willing to sit down and think about it for an hour, let's say, then perhaps it's not important enough to share your opinion with millions of people and reap the consequences. And Twitter is, although it's a social media platform that facilitates impulsivity, it's also a broad-scale publishing platform, and it's not obvious that you should be publishing all your instantaneous responses to cultural events. And it's a funny thing for me because it's not that easy to dissociate that from responsibility. I feel that I have a responsibility to bring to light, let's say, certain elements of the culture war that are going on at a deep level. And part of the reason that I use Twitter the way that I do use it is to do that. But then it does have that problem of intense negativity. And I learned from walking through airports with my wife, we had this discussion a couple of times. Airports have bothered me a lot ever since 9/11. I review them as, they're like for me, they're the bleeding edge of the totalitarian incursion into general day-to-day life. And they've always made me very uncomfortable. I don't like lining up for the screenings, the theatrical screenings and so forth. And that made me very bitchy and hard to get along with in airports. And, I had a conversation with my wife, a fairly detailed conversation. And our decision was, if I'm in an airport and something happens that annoys me but isn't important enough to actually sit down and write about, then I have to just ignore it or shut up about it. And this has also helped me calibrate my responses. And it's the same problem with Twitter, right? Is that something can be irritating and be genuinely irritating, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the most appropriate way to deal with it is to share your irritation in the moment. And part of the reason Twitter is so pathological, perhaps, and is such a snake pit of polarization is because it does encourage that kind of impulsive and immediate response to things that are perhaps of sufficient seriousness so that they should only be taken seriously.
Yeah, it encourages many things that I think are ultimately producing some consequential delusions for us individually and at scale. It provides a kind of an illusion of conversation because you'll tweet something at me, I'll tweet something at you, and we seem to be talking. But as you know, we're primarily talking in front of our respective audiences, which are different, which are largely different, right? So when I say something to you, it's my audience is at my back, and vice versa. So much communication becomes performative, and that starts to degrade the kind of the good faith characteristics of a real conversation, and people just wind up scoring points on each other, and it encourages that. That's the kind of thing, dunks are the kind of thing that tend to go viral. It selects for a kind of dishonesty. There's an ethic where, there are very few people feel a real need. I mean, certainly anyone who's any kind of activist, politically, left or right, doesn't feel much of a need to really get their opponent's position correct before savaging it. They don't mind distorting it, especially if they can use clips of their opponent that have been artfully edited so as to make them seem to be saying something that they weren't in fact saying in context. They will use that as a way of just smearing the person. You want to hold someone accountable for the worst possible version of what they might have said, however implausible it really is, as long as that can be made to stick. And people just see what can be made to stick, and they almost never go back and clean up their, apologize for their errors and go back and clean up their mess.